Right here, the author of the book Logical Chess Move by Move makes the point that black is threatening to win a pawn here. For example, if white were to make a random move, takes, 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 takes. And the reason this is good for black is because there's a bishop hanging. But they overlooked one thing, a surprising idea that Stockfish finds out of nowhere that white has in this position. You would like to pause. What do you think the move is for white? If you had a chance to look at that, we're going to look at this entire game. We will talk about this moment in more detail, but I'm going to start at the beginning so you can kind of follow along. So welcome to episode 9 in a series where we're going through this book, Logical Chess Move by Move. This game was a lot of fun. I'm excited to go through it. Let's just jump right in. So first of all, we have e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and bishop to b5. This is called the Ruy Lopez. Now, for a lot of beginners, the Ruy Lopez is kind of a mysterious opening, and I totally get it because I remember when I first started, it doesn't make a lot of sense at first because it's like, okay, you're attacking the pawn, and black's defending the pawn, so we're attacking the defender because once we eliminate the defender, we want to win the pawn, right? But really, that's not the point. And for example, after a6, which is the main move here, you don't really want to take this usually because if you go for this line, black plays queen to d4, forks you. When you save the knight, they take the pawn, and it's actually black who has the better position, okay? So going back to the question of then why do we even play bishop to b5? It's like, what are we doing? If we're not even going to win the pawn, why not just go like with the Italian game on bishop c4 instead? That seems to make more sense because you're actually threatening the weak pawn and stuff, right? Here's the deal. The point is, long term, as the game develops and as things change, we are going to have that pressure, and maybe at some point when we're ready, we will take the pawn. Or maybe we'll play d4 because we can very easily play d4 now because we've got this knight that might be pinned if this pawn ever moves, right? It kind of stops black from moving the pawn forward because then you walk into a pin and things can change quickly. So it's more of a long-term type of a deal than like an immediate threat to win a pawn, okay? So that's the idea. Let's keep going here. So a6 is played and bishop to a4. Goes in line with what I said, just kind of keeping the pressure there. We already talked about why you don't want to actually trade for the knight, okay? Knight to f6, very nice move, develops a piece, attacks a pawn, and white castles. Now, why doesn't white defend the pawn? Simple question, but what do you guys think? What is the answer? Why does white not defend the pawn? All right, well, if you had a chance to look at that, the reason is, if black wants to take, they could totally take the pawn. But they're not getting a free pawn because we're going to play rook to e1 at some point. We don't have to do it immediately. We could also play d4, but we could play it right away. And we can always get our pawn back on e5 whenever we want. Even if black tries to defend this knight somehow with f5 or d5, we can chase that away whenever we want. It has to move, and we can simply take this. We could trade the bishop if we want. We don't have to. We already have two attackers. So black can never hold on to the pawn, okay? So if they do take the pawn, they're essentially going into it with the idea of like, well, I'm just going to trade these pawns because I want the position to be kind of open and go from there. But you really have to know what you're doing if you're playing this as black, right? Because your king is still there and you've not castled. And you can very easily get into trouble if you're not careful, okay? So that's why we don't defend. And that's why in this game, black actually doesn't take the pawn. They just play bishop e7. They don't want to get into any trouble. And I think for a lot of beginners, this is a much more solid move. Don't cause yourself any problems or headaches if you don't have to. Get your king to safety, okay? Or at least be prepared. You can castle any moment that you need to. You're ready to go, okay? When the bishop is still on f8, it takes 2 moves. Things can change quickly in a chess game. You can get into trouble. All right. So white plays rook to e1, which is pretty common in the Ruy Lopez, defending the pawn here. And, oh, yeah, interesting moment here. He mentions that this is actually preferable to playing knight to c3. And I think a lot of beginners will struggle with this because don't you want to develop your knight and defend the pawn at the same time? Why would you want to move a rook instead of getting a piece out? So if you haven't read the book already, what do you guys think the answer to that question is? Why would we want to move our rook instead of our knight to defend this pawn? All right, well, those of you who read the book with me, you'll know the answer to this, but it has to do with this bishop over here. And when you play the Ruy Lopez, a lot of times black's going to play b5 at some point, chase your bishop back, and then maybe play knight a5 and trade it. And that's a good attacking piece. A lot of times we don't want to allow that trade to happen, the knight for the bishop. So the way we prevent that is by moving our pawn to c3 and tucking the bishop back on c2 at some point. Okay, we can't do that if our knight's blocking it on c3, right? We can't move this pawn. The bishop is basically going to get captured, right? If black wants to, so at some point this is going to happen and the bishop's going to get captured. Not right here, but eventually. So that's the idea. That's why we use the rook. Okay, b5, chases the bishop back. We go back. We don't want to lose the bishop. And d6. Now, d6 is actually doing a couple things. Number one, it's defending this pawn, which is important for black. We're going to talk about that more in just a second. It's also letting this bishop out. But some of you might notice it's blocking this guy. And he makes he's blocking this guy. And he makes the point of like, is it good for black to do that? Like, is it good for black to let out one bishop but block another one in? And sorry, I keep drawing knight arrows with the bishop. What do you guys think? Like, what's the deal with d6? Is it okay to do that, or is it a bad move because of this? All right, well, the answer is it's totally fine. And the reason is because even though the bishop is going to get blocked in from going further on this diagonal, it's already been moved once. And it's already actually doing a pretty good job. So first of all, it's blocking the e-file, so black doesn't have to worry about any shenanigans with the rook lining up on the king because you've got the bishop blocking it. It's also stopping any pins. So if this bishop ever lands on g5 here, there's no pin because the bishop. And it's out of the way so you can castle. So it's not really in the way of what black is trying to do. So because of that, it's okay to go to d6. Now, yes, it's more passive than like an aggressive square like c5. But that's totally fine. Even just moving your pieces one square off of the back rank is still considered a good developing move. Okay, so because of that, black can play d6 and it's really not a big deal. All right. So c3 has played because white is getting ready for black's next move, knight to a5. Remember, we talked about it. Black a lot of times likes to go ahead and trade that knight for the bishop, and white says, no, thank you. I want to keep my bishop, and now I will go back to c2. That's why we played c3, and that's why earlier white didn't want to play knight to c3. Now, some of you, I imagine, are wondering, if black really wants to get this bishop, why did they wait so long, right? Why not just go get it earlier? Like, why do you wait until white plays c3, right? So like at this moment, as soon as you chase it, why don't you just go here and take it, right? Does anybody see why that doesn't work for black? Why that's not a great idea? If you had a chance to look at that, it has to do with the fact that the e5 pawn is undefended. So you're doing it at a cost of losing a pawn, essentially. Yeah, you can do this, but now you're down a pawn. And you don't really have a way to get your pawn back. I mean, it's just a free pawn. So if you want to sack a pawn to do that, okay, but that's the idea. Okay, so that's why black plays d6, defending that guy. Now they are threatening to go here, and now we see white plays c3 to deal with that, all right? Knight a5, bishop goes back. Okay, let's keep going. So black plays c5. This is a pretty common idea in the Ruy Lopez, where black is expanding on the queen side. It adds support to the center, right? Because white's going to try to play d4, and so black's adding some tension there, and also giving the queen some options. Okay, and this is another important point about knight to a5. It made way for this to happen, right? You wouldn't have been able to do this if your knight was blocking it, right? Keep going. So white plays d4 anyway, and this is, when you play e4 openings, you have to know at some point in the future you're going to try to play d4. That's just pretty much what you do. The question is, when is a good time to do that? But white has prepared that significantly. You've got the pawn, you've got the knight, you've got the queen supporting it. You can definitely get away with playing d4 here. And if black were to, let's just say, trade, what happens now is black has an isolated pawn. Not very good. Isolated pawns are weak. They are targets. Also, the knight is very solid on d4. It can't be chased away because there's no more pawns on the c or the e file for black. And so a lot of good things about the position for white if black were to just trade everything. Okay? So because of that, black says, no thanks, I'll just play queen to c7. There was an extra attacker here on e5, and so black says, I'll just add a defender. Okay? And here we get to a very interesting moment in the game, because white plays the move h3. Now, for those of you who have been following this series from the beginning, which you should, by the way, if you haven't, it's fantastic. There's lots of great stuff that we're learning. But one of the things that we've learned is don't move the pawns in front of your king. Don't move the pawns in front of your castled king, because when you do that, you create weaknesses, right? Right. Nothing wrong there. That's just true. But he makes a point here, and he has a couple paragraphs talking about this. But he says basically that weaknesses are only weaknesses if your opponent can take advantage of them, right? So can black take advantage of this right away? Well, not exactly. When you play h3, you create a weakness here on g3. It's no longer supported by 2 pawns, only this guy. In some of the other games that we looked at, there was a bishop lined up here, so that square on g3 was super vulnerable. In this game, not the case. Bishop's back on e7. Okay, so maybe not quite as a weakness there. Also, if black's able to play like h6, g5, g4, this could be a hook that they could use to attack you. But wait a second, white's already been striking at the center. If black spends 3 moves playing h6 and g5, white's probably going to be able to make some stuff happen in the center, I imagine, or somewhere else on the board. They're going to have time to do stuff. I'm trying to see what Stockfish recommends. Yeah, Stockfish actually says you don't even have to panic. Just keep doing what you're doing with your knight. And if this happens, you just take, and then I imagine you do something in the center. Yeah, maybe you take or you push. And basically, you're fine. The point is, here's the point. Black is not in a position to take advantage of this. I mean, I think h6, g5 would be their best try, but we saw there, Stockfish is like, I'm not worried about it. There's not really an attack for black. So you have to not only think about like the moves that might be creating weaknesses, but can your opponent take advantage of it? And sometimes there's a trade-off. Okay, so in this position, the trade-off is if you don't play h3, this bishop's coming here. It's going to be a really nasty pin, and it's very relevant to what's going on in the position. There's all this tension on the dark squares that the knight is really helping with. And if black is able to get that bishop there, create the pin, well, now you're going to have some problems if you're playing as white. Not the end of the world, but that's kind of the idea. And so we make an exception to the rule of don't moving the pawns in front of the king, because in this position, that pin is actually really, really annoying. Okay? So do you guys see how you can't always say, I'm never going to play h3. I'm just never going to do it. No, there's got to be an exception from time to time, and that's what we're seeing here. Okay? Hope that makes sense. It's very, very important that you understand that. So black plays knight to c6. Okay, so all right, here we go. Here, this is the super interesting moment in the game where the author actually missed something really, really fascinating. So we're going to talk about it. This is what I said at the very beginning. Black is threatening to win a pawn. And the reason is if you just play a random move like king h1, this is what the author said. Takes, takes, takes. And if you try to recapture the pawn, you're going to actually lose your bishop or lose a piece. So for example, takes, he takes a knight. If I don't want to lose a knight, I have to recapture. But then my bishop is left undefended. Okay, and he leaves it at that in the book. He's like, it's bad, you lose a piece, end of story. But when I was looking at this, I realized something fascinating. What I realized was Stockfish's evaluation of this position shows equal. And I said to myself, Nelson, if it's an equal position, but black has an extra piece, 3-2, what's going on? Because see, normally when you win a piece, Stockfish is like, oh yeah, -3 or +3 or whatever, because you're up a piece. But it says it's equal. I'm like, okay. So something is going on. If you had a chance to look at it from earlier, maybe you noticed this. The move is knight to c3. And what happens after knight to c3 is black's queen is trapped. You can't go here. You can't go here. You can't go here. You can't go here. You can't take the knight. You can't. It's trapped. And white has a very simple plan of playing rook to e2 and taking the queen. Okay, that's interesting, isn't it? So why is it equal? b4, sorry, let me do this move. Yeah, b4, rook to e2, trapping the queen. And here's what Stockfish says black has to do. Sacrifice here with check. So now the queen has gotten rid of 2 bishops, and now the pawn can take the knight. So you got 3 pieces for the queen. Now, this is fascinating because normally, and I've done a video on this on the channel a long time ago, I had a game like this where I had 3 pieces against my opponent's queen, and I won the game. And I talked about how, generally speaking, the 3 pieces are going to be more powerful than the queen. But in this position, Stockfish says it's actually equal, maybe even a little bit better for white, because black has not developed totally yet. This guy's still in the back, and he hasn't castled. And white is not going to wait around. White's pieces are ready to go. 2 rooks, queen. He's going to play e5. And, okay, you got to do something about the pawn. You take it. And then, I guess you don't have to take it. Actually, it wants this move. Throw in this first. Then you take it. And then the rook comes down, so he's preventing you from castling, because if you castle, you're going to lose your bishop. It's a total mess. I don't really know what's going on. Apparently, it's slightly better for white, but the 3 pieces are very powerful still, so it's an interesting position. The point is that all of this was kind of lurking in the position, and if you didn't take the time to actually look a little bit further, you would have probably missed it. I think most people, going back to where was the original position here, most people would probably think, yeah, let's see, takes. Oh, yep, lose a piece. No good. Move on to the next line. Let's keep going. But no, there's this queen trap, right? So I don't know. I just wanted to show you guys that. Fascinating line, queen trap, sacrifice for the 3 pieces. Super interesting. And it just goes to show there's so many tactics that are lurking in positions when you're, when you have stockfish to tell you what the best move is. So anyway, going back to the game, white didn't want to deal with that. And that's why they played bishop to e3. Okay, just defending, adding another defender. Okay, well, let's keep going. And where was I? I got so sidetracked by that. Okay, yeah, here we go. So black castles. All right. Knight b to d2, and he points out again, it looks like a very passive square for the knight. It's like it's not really doing a whole lot, but it allows the rook to communicate with the queen and the other rook, gets it off of the back, which is important. It's still considered a good developing move, just like bishop e7 was for black. Okay? Knight b to d2. Keep going. Bishop to d7, same kind of story. Even though it's only one move, it's good. It's also better than getting forked. So you got to watch out if you would have went to e6. Oop, there's a pawn fork. Don't want to do that. Okay. So bishop to d7. Now, rook to c1. Important note here that you want to be aware of. Rooks a lot of times need to go on open files. Okay. Open files are files that have no pawns on them. And then you also have half open files where it only has one color pawn on it. That's where your rooks want to go. In this position, we have no open files. Okay, not a single piece has been traded. All the pawns are on the board. So the next best thing is to move your rooks to the center, is what he says. And I think that makes a lot of sense. Also, you get the bonus that it's lined up on a queen. So if you can ever line up, even though there's lots of pieces in between, you never know like what's going to happen, right? Like black at any moment might decide to trade, and all of a sudden it's like, okay, now there might be some tactics here. Like maybe this could be a, you never know what's going to happen is what I'm trying to say. So it's good to like line up the rooks on the high value pieces if you can. All right, let's keep going. So black plays knight to e8. And what black's trying to do is play f5, which is a good plan, and expand over here and maybe trap this bishop, maybe open up the f file for their rook. Lots of things that they could do. And so they're just moving the knight out of the way so that they can do that. White plays knight to f1. Very common idea in the Ruy Lopez of rerouting this knight either to g3 or to f3, where it can jump to some different squares. If you want to attack on the king side, if you want to control the center more, pretty good plan for the knight. So that's what white's doing. And black plays the move g6. Now, why did black play g6? And what are your thoughts about this move? Go ahead and pause and think about this for a second. All right, well, if you had a chance to look at that, the reason black played g6 is twofold. Number one, they wanted to deal with knight to g3 by having the pawn ready to go. Okay, that's the first point. And the other point is they're wanting to play f5 anyway, so now they have an extra supporter there. They could recapture with the pawn if they needed to and keep attacking here with the pawns. Okay, but what is the problem? Well, the problem is, of course, the weak squares around the king, right? They've done it again. They've created these weak squares. Now, similar to this, but this is maybe even more weakening, I would say, because at least on h3, you still have the f-pawn, which is supporting the dark squares. Here you have nothing, and you have nothing, okay? However, remember, it's only weakness if your opponent can take advantage of it. So what does white do? Well, bishop h6. It makes sense, right? Immediately puts pressure, and the rook is actually trapped. Now, you can't take the rook right away because black plays knight to g7, but you're starting to position your pieces to take advantage of the weaknesses. Okay, nice move here by white. What do you think white played next? You had a chance to look at that. It's knight to e3. And we already talked about this knight. Had 2 different places, right, that it wanted to go. This one, it's kind of already been shut down by the pawn on g6, so it doesn't make as much sense. But this one, look at this. The square on d5. Square on d5 is called a hole. Okay, a hole in chess is a square where no pawns can attack it. Right? There's no pawn back here that could move up and attack. There's no pawn here that could move up and attack. So that's a really valuable square for the knight because it's going to be hard for black to chase it away. Okay, so knight to e3 is a great move. Rook A to E8, and black basically at this point says, look, I better just start defending. I'm getting into some trouble. They could still play F5, but I think the reason that they didn't want to is because after knight D5, takes, queen D5 check, it's looking pretty scary for the king. And I don't think black wanted to deal with that kind of position. So they decided, you know what, let me just try to defend here instead of this. And so instead of F5, they have rook A to E8. All right. So knight to D5 anyway. Good move for white. Takes advantage of the hole, threatens the queen. Queen moves. And now white plays a pretty nice move. But it wasn't a move that I originally thought of, and I'll explain why. So if you want to pause, if you haven't read the book, what do you think white played here? All right, if you had a chance to look at that, the move played is knight takes e7. Now, here's the thing. Usually, in a lot of cases, when you have a knight that is this powerful, just look at this guy, just sitting in the center of the board, controlling everything. It's supported by the pawn. It can't be chased away because it's a hole. It's an outpost. Usually, I'm not going to take a bishop like that. A bishop that's kind of passive, that's kind of stuck back here. I'm like, nope, my knight is super powerful. I'm not going to do that. And Stockfish kind of agrees, actually. Like, Stockfish is saying the best moves are like queen d2, a4, like bishop b3, doing some other stuff. Stockfish kind of agrees. However, practically speaking, as soon as you take that bishop, you have eliminated, and we saw something similar in the last week's episode, right? You've eliminated a key defender of these dark squares. So, yes, you lose your powerful knight. Yes, black doesn't have a passive bishop anymore. But the dark squares are weak, and you still have your bishop, and your queen, and your knight, and your rooks, and, you know, maybe you could take advantage of that. So from a practical standpoint, it makes a lot of sense. And Stockfish actually doesn't mind it. It thinks it's a totally okay move. It's just not the top choice. All right? So I thought that was a very interesting move. All right, let's keep going. So rook takes e7. And now black trades here. White trades here. And the reason is they want to invade with the queen. And notice, it's all happening on the dark squares. Look at all this stuff that's happening on the dark squares. And now that the bishop is gone, it's much easier for white to do that. Okay, so the obvious threat is just to take the pawn here on c5. It's undefended. And so black says, oh, I should probably deal with that. d4. Okay, what do you think black played what do you think white played in this position? All right, if you had a chance to look at that, the move is queen to f6. And we're simply threatening checkmate, but we're also kind of infiltrating along those dark squares with our pieces. All right, now, it's not that simple because black can simply play knight to h5. And it's not checkmate because the knight would just take you, okay? And black's threatening your queen. So what do you do here? The move is queen h4. And you want to be careful. You don't want to go to like a square like queen g5 because then you can get chased away with a tempo. And now the rook is actually helping to support, and black's position all of a sudden is not so bad, okay? So it's important when you're attacking that you don't give up free tempos to your opponent. So going to h4, well, now black doesn't really have time to do this unless they're willing to give up their rook, okay? Before, it was a free tempo on the queen, right? That's why we want to go to h4 and not to g5, okay? So here, black says, well, I guess I'll just go back to g7 because it blocks off the bishop. And if white's going to go back and forth, I'll be happy to just get a draw. My position seems kind of rough. I'll just take a draw if that's what's going to happen. So what did white play, obviously, to avoid the draw? All right, if you had a chance to look at that, this is a very difficult move, I think, for a lot of people to find. And so let's try to talk through this. So the move was bishop to e3. So why would we take a piece that we moved there to take advantage of these dark squares and move it backwards? Why would we do such a thing? Well, one reason is because black is kind of defended pretty nicely. Like, there's not an immediate way for us to go through. We already talked about what happens if we go there. We obviously don't want to trade this powerful bishop for that knight. We don't have any more pieces that can immediately come into the action. I mean, you could play knight to g5, I guess. Actually, knight to g5 we should probably talk about, because knight to g5 maybe looks like you're going to threaten to do this and this. But it goes back to that f6 move. Okay, f6, and if you tried to do this, they would just take the knight, and you just don't really have anything. So it's not so simple, okay? So the reason you go back is to create new threats somewhere else to give black more problems to deal with. That's kind of the first point. Like, if you're attacking and it's just like, well, there's just nothing there, find a different way to attack somewhere else. Okay, that's what white is doing. And also, there's kind of a more advanced thing. They're trying to lure this knight away, in a sense, and you're going to see why. So, and that's exactly what happens. Knight moves to e6 to deal with the bishop moving here. And now white plays queen back to f6. And what's the difference? There's no knight to h5 now to chase the queen away. Okay? Very subtle, like super subtle thing. Just go back, threaten this, and black's like, well, I'll move my knight. And then all of a sudden, okay, I'm back to f6. Very, very interesting stuff, right? All right, let's keep going. So queen to c7, this pawn was being attacked, and black is defending. And now, surprise, surprise, white goes back because this knight has been moved. And guess what? You can't go knight g7 anymore. It's just checkmate. Which means now black has some serious problems because it's going to be hard to get rid of these pieces, and it's a much more dangerous position. Okay, so do you see how that subtle little move of just going back kind of changed everything? Very, very tricky, but it's good to know. All right, so let's see. Rook to c8. Black doesn't want to lose the rook for the bishop, so they move it to safety. And now, again, we have a pretty tricky moment in the position. It's white to play. What do you think white should play here? All right, so the move that was played in what they talk about in the book is rook c to d1. And he goes on to say how masters a lot of times don't look for these super complicated, crazy 15-move calculations to win games. They don't need to, and it's actually easier and more consistent if they just small advantages that just add up over the course of the game. Like just a little at a time leads to a victory. And that is what this move is kind of showing. It's like, look, I've done this little maneuver. I've got these pieces right where I want them. Black is extremely tied up. You can't move the knight because you get checkmated. You can't move the pawn because it's blockaded. You can't move the bishop really because the knight's blocked. Black can't really move, so white says, I have no reason to rush. I'll just get a piece that's not doing something and bring it in. Now, if you wanted a more aggressive approach, you could have played knight to g5 also. The point is, the knight can't take. You have checkmate, but you're not actually threatening anything. Like, for example, if you take this, they recapture with the pawn and there's no checkmate. So that's kind of the reason why knight g5 isn't really that great. Stockfish said the point maybe would be to bring the rook up and over if you really want to get crazy with it. But from a practical standpoint, I think just bringing the rook to the file makes a lot of sense. Okay. So black goes back, and this is actually a tricky move. This is something you want to watch out for. When you are attacking and you have the queen in a powerful position like this, you have to watch out for queen trades. Okay, because if white just makes a random move, like let's just say king h1, black's going to go queen d8, force a queen trade. And after the queens are traded, all of a sudden, black's position is not so bad. It's really not. So that's black's idea, and white needs to figure out how do I stop this, because this is coming next move. So what do? You get a chance to look at that. The move is knight to h2. Very, very clever move. And the point is that now when black goes here, you play knight to g4, you defend, and now if black wants to trade queens, they can do it, but it comes at a heavy cost. Look at this, look at this, look at this. Triple fork action, right? You're just going to lose a piece, essentially. Okay? So very, very nice idea. And by the way, it's, again, taking advantage of the dark squares. All right, so black doesn't want to do that. They decide to play queen e7. I mean, there's really not much that black can do. Maybe they're trying to make space for the rook. Their position is so tied up. And at this point, white finds the winning combination. You guys would like to pause. What's the winning combination here? All right, well, if you had a chance to look at that. So I wanted to give you that test because if you're looking for a checkmate, you weren't going to find it. Okay, there's no checkmate here. Black has done a pretty nice job of defending. But there is a way to just win a piece. And going back to what he said earlier about how masters get these small advantages, winning a piece is significant enough that you can win the endgame usually 90% of the time, if not more. But you don't have to get a checkmate, and that's what happens here. He says, okay, I trade the queens, which opens up the square for my knight. I jump in with a fork. The king has to move to the corner. And now I just take the piece. And it's a winning endgame, just like that. Yes, there could be a trade. Who cares? We take it. This is a winning endgame for white. That simple. So again, don't feel like you have to always get checkmate. I mean, of course, if there's a checkmate there, great. Find it, play it, do it. Absolutely. But you can also win a game just like this. You take advantage of the dark squares and at the right moment, you trade and go into the winning end game of it. Fascinating game. I hope you guys learned a lot from this one. I had a lot of fun going through it. Um, if you have not caught up on all the previous episodes, make sure you do that. And also, I want to mention there is a free middle game guide that I created. It's top 10, or it's not top, it's like 10 middle game moves. So it's like 10 ideas for the middle game. You guys can check out. I'm going to put the link in the description as well as like a pinned comment. I spent a lot of time putting that together. It's totally free, so go check it out. You're going to learn a lot from that. Okay, now what we're going to do is jump to questions from the previous episode. All right, so this is the previous week's game. There's a position here. Somebody mentioned something. So in last time I talked about how when black captured this pawn, white recaptured here because you wanted to keep the pawn controlling some of these squares. Didn't want to take with the knight. One thing that I forgot to mention is like if you do take with the knight, you will, potentially lose this pawn with check, which is going to expose your king. So very good point. Thank you, Sandeep, for pointing that out. That's absolutely right. Let me read some more comments here. Balkabadi7745, if I pronounced that correctly, said, when I got to this channel, my chess rating increased from 870 to 1300. Awesome. That's awesome to hear. Let's see. You like the format of, hey, we have a good move in this position. Let's find out together how we can arrive at the good move. Yep, absolutely. Some good comments on Stockfish. Yeah, I'm not going to go into that, but absolutely agree with you on the Stockfish comments there. Your copy's arriving at the end of May. Can't wait to go through this. Awesome. Mike Suppa, 7706. Excited to see that. Arjun D78 asks, and Grandmaster see it too. Okay, let me see which timestamp this is at. 2613. Okay, so he's talking about further in the game. Let me jump ahead here. Oh, he's talking about Grandmaster seeing some of these crazy lines. Yes, yes, yes. Okay, so we talked last time about how G6 was only a mistake if you could take advantage of it, and there was some crazy Stockfish lines. Let me see if I can find where those lines were at. Let's see. Yeah, I think it was like right here. If you play like F6, yeah, this was the move. So how would Grandmasters find it? I think is the question. Let me look at this. How do they see it? Do they calculate all the way through? Do they see strategically ahead, tactically experienced? Yeah. Okay, so basically, Grandmasters are really good with like coming up with lots of new ideas. So the big takeaway I think would be most beginners, intermediate, even some advanced players, they see the knight, it's under attack, and they're like, okay, I have to move it, or I have to defend it, or something like that. So let's see. Can I move it? No, no, no. Okay, can't move it anywhere. Can I defend it? No. Can I defend it with the queen? Let's see. No. Here. No. Okay. Here. And, or maybe bishop c8. Okay, but then there's a sacrifice. Do I want that? That's what you would think about. A grandmaster is going to be like, well, yeah, I could defend it, but I could also maybe counterattack. And they would start thinking about other moves. And at some point, f6 would probably pop into their mind. They're really good with like coming up with these clever and tricky things and all sorts of just different ideas. Okay, so that's why I think they would see it. And once they get even a part of an idea, they're going to start calculating really quickly. Like, yeah, what actually happens if this happens? Takes. That's kind of interesting because even if I lose this, I slide my king over. Now I've got an attack here. But what if the knight takes? But then I can start taking here, and maybe that doesn't really quite look like it's going to work for me. But what if I trade here first? Let's see, does this change anything? They're just going to like start thinking about stuff, and they might find it. Now, not every time, but what I meant was like a lot of the times grandmasters will come up with some of these types of ideas. And yeah, just a lot of experience, I think, and very, very good at tactics. And that you put all that together, and you can come up with these moves sometimes. That being said, I could also see a lot of grandmasters probably missing a move like this as well. Okay, so yeah, let's see. Loving the series, Vane76. Ronald says reading the book, but your explanations make it even more easy to follow. Awesome. Great. Yeah, keep going with the comments, guys. I love reading through these. I don't always mention all of them in the video, but I do appreciate seeing them. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Don't forget, if you want to follow along, you can get a copy of the book, or you can just keep watching these. Next week, game 10 is on page 61, and it's the French defense. So that'll be interesting. All right. See you guys next time. Stay sharp. Play smart. and take care. Oh, and don't forget, download the 10 middle game guides. It's free. It's the 10 middle game moves guide. It's free. Spent a lot of time putting that together and got some really good feedback already. So make sure if you want to copy that. All right, guys, take it easy.